This is a work of fiction. All characters, kingdoms, institutions, and events are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental and unintended. Story: Queen Myril's dramatic exit follows the banker's bombshell about the late Queen's Swiss assets. Document 1 of 3. There are moments in the life of a royal house when the silence becomes louder than any announcement, when the doors that were always open stay shut, when the flags that were always flying come down without a word. The kingdom of Eldenmore had known many such moments across its centuries, but none, not one, had ever felt quite like the morning Queen Myril walked out of Thornwall Palace and did not look back. Nobody saw it coming. That was the strangest part. Even those who had spent years watching the inner workings of the Eldenmore royal house, those who had pressed their ears to the walls of the great corridors and read the smallest tremors in the ground beneath the palace, had not seen what was building. They had noticed that Queen Myril had grown quieter over the past weeks. They had noticed that she canceled 2 public engagements without explanation. They had noticed that she did not appear at the annual garden ceremony which she had attended without fail for the past 7 years. But these things individually meant nothing. A queen was allowed her quiet days. A queen was allowed her silences. What nobody had noticed, what nobody had been allowed to notice, was what was happening inside the private wing of Thornwall Palace during those same weeks. What nobody knew was that a conversation had taken place, a conversation between the royal house of Eldenmore and a private banking institution based in the Swiss city of Zurich, a conversation that had uncovered something so staggering, so completely unexpected, that even the most senior palace officials had gone pale when they heard it. A conversation that had rewritten, in a single afternoon, everything the kingdom thought it knew about the woman who had sat on the throne for 43 years and built a legacy no one had ever dared question. Queen Sarantha of Eldenmore had died 14 months earlier. She was 81 years old and had reigned through wars, recessions, public scandals, and the shifting tides of a kingdom that had not always been easy to hold together. Her death had been expected for some time. She had been ill for 2 years, and yet when it came, the grief across Eldenmore had been total and genuine. People had lined the streets for her funeral procession for 6 hours in the rain, standing without umbrellas, not because they were told to, but because they could not imagine doing anything else. She had been that kind of queen, steady, certain, permanent in the way that only the most enduring things are: mountains, old forests, the deep note of a cathedral bell. Her son, King Aldric, had assumed the throne the same day, and had done so with the careful dignity that the kingdom expected of him. At his side was his wife of 11 years, Queen Myril. She had come into the royal family not as a young woman, but as a woman already formed, confident, composed, with an inner life that she kept private and a public manner that was warm without ever quite becoming intimate. The people of Eldenmore had accepted her. Some had grown to genuinely love her. She was not Queen Sarantha, but then, who could be? She was Myril, and in the first 14 months of the new reign, she had carried out her duties with the kind of quiet consistency that made people begin to relax. Then came the bankers. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, addressed not to King Aldric, but to the office of the royal household, specifically to the Lord Chamberlain, a careful and somewhat colorless man named Lord Fenwick Carroll, who had served Queen Sarantha for 31 years, and now served her son with the same humorless reliability. The letter was from Haller & Sohn, a private banking house in Zurich that had operated for 200 years and handled the financial affairs of several European royal families and aristocratic estates. It was written in the precise, formal language of banking institutions, which meant it was almost impossible to read without legal training. Lord Carroll had legal training. He read it twice, very slowly, and then he sat in his leather chair for 11 minutes without moving. Then he called a private meeting. The individuals summoned to that meeting were the royal treasurer, the senior legal counsel to the crown, and the private secretary to King Aldric. They met in Lord Carroll's office, which was at the back of the east wing and had windows that looked out over a stone courtyard where no one ever walked. Lord Carroll closed the door himself, which was unusual. He placed the letter on the table between them and said simply that they needed to understand what it contained before any decision could be made about how to proceed. What it contained was this: Haller & Sohn had maintained a private account in the name of Queen Sarantha of Eldenmore for a period of 38 years. The account had been opened under a secondary designation, a private name, not a title, and had been structured in such a way that it existed entirely outside the formal financial records of the Eldenmore royal estate. It was not illegal. Swiss private banking permitted such arrangements, but it was deeply, significantly, and extraordinarily secret. And the total sum held within it, including accrued interest over 38 years, was 347 million sterling. Lord Carroll let the number sit in the room for a moment before he continued. The account had a designated beneficiary. That beneficiary was not King Aldrich. It was not any member of the royal family. It was not a charitable institution or a trust established by the Crown. The designated beneficiary, as specified in the original account documentation, and confirmed by the formal succession clause filed with Haller & Son in the year of the late Queen's first serious illness, was an individual whose name, when Lord Carroll read it aloud in that small room with the stone courtyard beyond the windows, caused 3 people to sit completely still for almost 30 seconds. The name was Myrill Renard, Queen Myrill's name before her marriage. It was the royal treasurer who spoke first. He asked whether this could be a coincidence, whether there was another woman by that name, or whether the name referred to a different period, a different document. Lord Carroll said he had already checked. The birth date on the account documentation matched exactly. The address listed was the apartment in the capital where Myrill Renard had lived before her engagement to Prince Aldrich. There was no room for coincidence. The late Queen Sarantha, in the final years of her life, had secretly designated her daughter-in-law as the sole beneficiary of a hidden account containing 347 million sterling. What they did not yet know, what would take them another week of careful, private investigation to begin to understand, was why. King Aldrich was told on a Thursday evening in his private study by Lord Carroll alone. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. What was said between them has never been confirmed by any official source. What is known is that the king did not appear at the following morning's scheduled public address. His office released a statement saying he was dealing with a private matter of estate administration. This was technically true. It was also the most compressed version of the truth that language could accommodate. Queen Myrill was informed the following morning. She was told by her husband, not by Lord Carroll, which was the detail that would later seem most significant to those who analyzed these events. He told her alone, in the private sitting room of their residential suite, with no staff present and no record of what was said. What happened in that room, what expressions moved across their faces, what words were spoken, whether there were raised voices or long silences, belongs to the sealed interior of a marriage that had, until that morning, appeared entirely stable. What emerged from that room, 2 hours later, was a queen who walked down the long corridor of the residential wing with a posture so perfectly composed that the housekeeper who saw her pass later said she looked, in that moment, like a painting of herself. She went directly to her private office. She made 3 telephone calls that lasted, in total, less than 12 minutes. She then summoned her personal assistant and gave a series of quiet, orderly instructions. After that, she asked for her personal belongings to be prepared for transport. Not all of them. A selection. The things she had brought into the palace specifically before the marriage. Her private correspondence. Several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. 3 boxes of books. She did not ask for anything that had been given to her in her capacity as queen. By 6 in the evening of that same day, the courtyard at the side entrance of Thornwall Palace, not the main gate, not the ceremonial entrance, but the smaller, older door that opened onto a private lane, had a car waiting. A single car, not a royal motorcade. Not the armored vehicles that typically accompanied any movement of senior royals. A private car, dark and ordinary, with a single driver. Queen Myrill walked to it with 2 members of her personal staff. She carried nothing herself. She did not pause at the door. She did not look up at the building she was leaving. She got into the car and it drove away. By the following morning, the palace had released no statement. It was the absence of a statement that told people something had happened. Thornwall Palace issued statements constantly, small ones, formal ones, statements about engagements and appointments and charitable visits. The silence that descended over the palace press office that morning was unlike any silence the royal correspondents who covered Eldenmore could remember. Calls went unreturned. Emails received automated responses. The Royal Communications Director, a young woman named Petra Havorson who was normally available and efficient, appeared to have become entirely unreachable. By midday, the first fragment of a rumor had appeared on a private messaging channel used by royal correspondents. It said only that there had been a development of a significant nature inside the palace and that the queen consort might not be at her scheduled public appearance the following week. It did not say why. It did not say where she was. It did not say what the development was. But in the world of royal coverage, where information was always incomplete and always consequential, even a fragment like this was enough to start everything moving. Within 48 hours, the word Switzerland had appeared in whispers in 3 separate conversations between journalists who did not know each other well enough to have coordinated. None of them could say exactly where it came from. None of them had anything they could print. But the word was there, floating in the space between what was known and what was not, and it had arrived with a weight that suggested it was not simply a rumor. The people of Eldenmore, meanwhile, had begun to notice. A queen does not simply disappear from a kingdom's visual landscape without the kingdom noticing. Her photograph had been removed from the palace website's front page, something that could, technically, be explained by a scheduled update. Her name had been quietly removed from 3 upcoming public event programs, something that could, technically, be explained by scheduling changes. But the accumulation of small, quiet removals was itself a kind of signal, and the people of Eldenmore had been reading royal signals for a very long time. They were patient as they had always been patient. They did not panic. They waited. They watched the gates of Thornwall Palace with the particular attentiveness of people who have learned that gates tell stories, that the angle of a flag means something, that the timing of a light going on in a palace window at night can sometimes tell you more than any official statement ever will. And they sensed, without being able to articulate exactly why, that what was happening inside those gates was something that would change Eldenmore in ways they had not yet had the chance to imagine. What they did not know, what almost no one outside a very small circle of people inside Thornwall Palace knew, was that the story of the Swiss account was not simply the story of a secret sum of money and a surprising beneficiary. It was the beginning of a larger story. A story about why a woman as careful and deliberate as Queen Sarantha would have made such a designation. A story about what she had known, and when she had known it, and what she had been trying to do about it in the last years of her life. A story about the long, complex, deeply private relationship between a queen who had reigned for 4 decades, and the woman her son had chosen to bring into the house she had built. And it was a story that Queen Myril, sitting somewhere quiet and away from the palace, already knew the ending of. The car had taken her north, away from the capital, through the green and gray landscape of Eldenmore's upper country. She did not speak during the journey. Her assistant, seated beside her, understood enough to remain silent. The driver kept his eyes on the road. The world passed outside the windows, petrol stations, small towns, the pale flicker of a river between trees, and Queen Myril looked at none of it and all of it, in the way that a person looks at the world when they are not really seeing it because they are seeing something else entirely, something interior, something that only they can see. There was a house. There had always been a house, a private property registered under a family trust that she had maintained independently of her royal life, a modest stone building in the hills that almost nobody knew about and that she had visited on average twice a year quietly without announcement. It was the kind of place a person keeps when they understand that a life needs corners of its own, private corners, that belong to no role and no institution, and no set of expectations. When the car stopped and she stepped out into the gray afternoon air, the house was there as it had always been. The garden was slightly overgrown. The stone walls had the dark, damp look of a building that had been closed for too long. But the key turned in the lock as it always had, and inside it smelled the same old wood, a faint trace of wood smoke from a fire someone had lit months ago, the particular stillness of a house that has been waiting. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water from the tap, and sat down at the small table by the window where the hills were visible, dark against the sky. She sat there for a long time. Back at Thornwall Palace, Lord Carroll was drafting a statement. He had been drafting it in various forms for most of the day. Every version he produced seemed inadequate, either too much or not enough, either too explanatory or too opaque. The challenge was that any statement about Queen Myril's absence would prompt questions that the palace was not yet prepared to answer, and any refusal to issue a statement at all would prompt the same questions, only louder and from more directions at once. He was still drafting when his telephone rang. It was the private secretary to King Aldrich, calling from the king's residential floor. He said the king had made a decision about how to proceed. Lord Carroll listened. When the call ended, he put down the draft he had been working on and sat again in his leather chair, in the same stillness he had occupied when he first read the letter from Haller and Soane. The decision the king had made was not the one Lord Carroll had expected. It was more complicated than that, and it suggested that what was happening inside Thornwall Palace was not, as the world outside had begun to assume, the straightforward unraveling of a royal marriage. It was something older than that, something that had been building for a very long time. Something that the late Queen Sarantha, in her careful and deliberate way, had set in motion long before anyone, including, perhaps, Meyeril herself, had understood what she was doing. The account in Zurich was not just money. It was a message. And Lord Carroll, sitting in his chair in the room with the stone courtyard outside the window, was beginning to understand, slowly, and with the particular chill of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is different from what he thought it was, what that message said. Copy full text. This is a work of fiction. All characters, kingdoms, institutions, and events are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental and unintended. Story: Queen Myeril's dramatic exit follows the banker's bombshell about the late Queen's Swiss assets. Document 2 of 3. The investigation began quietly, as investigations of this nature always do, not with proclamations or formal inquiries, but with a single question asked in a careful voice to a single person who might know the answer. In this case, the question was asked by the senior legal counsel to the Crown, a woman named Adara Voss, who had practiced royal law for 26 years, and who had the particular talent of making very serious questions sound almost conversational. She asked it of the palace's longest-serving archivist, a man named Clement Frey, who had worked in the document rooms of Thornwall Palace since the year Queen Sarantha turned 50. The question was simple. She wanted to know whether there was any record, anywhere in the archive, of a private financial arrangement between the late Queen and the woman who was now Queen Meyeril. Any document, any letter, any notation, anything at all that predated the marriage. Clement Frey was quiet for a moment, then he said he would need to look. He looked for 3 days. What he found, or rather, what he did not find, was, in its own way, as significant as any document could have been. There was almost nothing. Where the late Queen's private correspondence was typically meticulous, densely catalogued, and carefully filed, the records from a specific 18-month window, spanning from roughly 3 years before the public announcement of the royal engagement to 6 months after it, contained a series of gaps. Not dramatic gaps, not the kind of gaps that immediately announced themselves as evidence of removal. Small, careful gaps, letters referenced in other letters that were not themselves present. A sequence of dates in which no private correspondence appeared, despite those same dates being fully documented in the official diary. A thin, invisible seam running through the archive that only a person who knew the archive as well as Clement Frey would have noticed at all. When he reported this to Adara Voss, she sat with the information for a long time without speaking. Then she said, someone was careful, and she did not mean it as a compliment. The question of who had been careful, and when, and with what precise intention, was one that now occupied the small group of people inside Thornwall Palace who knew what was happening. Lord Carroll, Adara Voss, the royal treasurer, and the king's private secretary met every morning in the same room with the stone courtyard, and each morning the picture they were assembling became slightly less incomplete, though it never became fully complete, because the thing about a picture that has been deliberately obscured is that the obscuring is itself part of the picture. What they were piecing together, slowly and with the meticulous patience of people who understood that every element mattered, was this. Queen Sarantha had known Meyeril Renard before the relationship with Prince Aldrich became known to the public. This was not, on its face, unusual. The world in which royals moved was small, and a young woman of Meyeril's background, educated, privately cultured, connected to the edges of several aristocratic families, might plausibly have crossed paths with the Queen at any number of events without it being remarkable. But the nature of the connection, as it began to take shape in Adara Voss's reconstruction, suggested something more deliberate than a social crossing of paths. There were traces. A guest list from a private dinner at one of the Queen's residences in the country, 3 years before the engagement. that included the name M. Renard alongside names that were all either old aristocracy or close personal friends of the Queen. A notation in the Queen's private diary, one of the very few to survive from that ambiguous 18-month window, that referred to a conversation about what the archivist translated as the question of succession and character. Though the handwriting was difficult, and Clement Frey admitted he could not be entirely certain of the third word. A payment recorded in a secondary household account, made to a private educational foundation with which Meyeril Renard had been associated professionally, at a time when there was no obvious reason for the palace to have had any connection to that foundation at all. Separately, each of these things was explainable. Together, they suggested that the late Queen Sarantha had not simply accepted her son's choice of partner. She had, in some sense that was not yet fully clear, participated in it. This was the theory that Adara Voss presented to the group on the 5th morning of their meetings. She presented it carefully, noting every point at which the evidence was thin and every point at which it was stronger, because she was a lawyer and lawyers present evidence in the precise shape of what they can and cannot prove. When she finished, the room was quiet for a while. The royal treasurer said slowly that if this was true, it raised a very obvious question. Lord Carroll said he knew what the question was. The king's private secretary said they needed to ask it of someone who could actually answer it. The someone they needed was Queen Meyeril. She had been at the house in the hills for 5 days. She had spoken to no one from the palace. She had made, as far as anyone could determine, no public statement and given no interview. The press, which had by now gathered in sufficient numbers outside the gates of Thornwall Palace that their presence could no longer be explained as coincidental, had received nothing from her. Her personal assistant had communicated only through a solicitor, and only to confirm that the Queen was safe, that she was in good health, and that she had no statement to make at this time. It was the king who called her. He called on a private number that very few people knew, and she answered on the 3rd ring. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. No transcript exists. No staff member was present at either end. What can be said about it is that when King Aldrich emerged from his private study afterward, he looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting one kind of furniture and found something else entirely. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he said to his private secretary, who happened to be passing, that he needed to speak to Lord Carroll immediately. What had changed was this: Meyeril had told him something. She had told him something that reframed, in a single conversation, the shape of the story he had been living inside for the past 11 years of their marriage. It did not make him less troubled. If anything, it made him more troubled, because the kind of trouble that comes from discovering that the people around you have been acting with intention in a direction you did not know about is a different and more disorienting kind of trouble than the kind that comes from simple betrayal. Simple betrayal, at least, has a clean shape. What Aldrich was now sitting with had no clean shape at all. It was irregular and multidirectional, and it implicated someone he had loved without complication for most of his life. His mother had known Meyeril before he did. She had, in some sense, chosen her, not commanded her son to marry her, nothing so blunt as that, but placed her carefully in his path, arranged for them to be in the same rooms, ensured that the connection, when it formed naturally and genuinely, which it had. Aldrich's feelings for Meyeril were entirely his own. Of that, Meyeril had been very clear. She had not manufactured the attraction or the relationship. She had not known, when she first met him, what she was being positioned to become. She had known only that she had been introduced to someone extraordinary and that something real had begun between them. But the late Queen had known. The late Queen had watched it form, had quietly supported it, had removed obstacles that might have stood in its way, and had done all of this without ever saying a word to anyone, not to her son, not to her advisors, and not, for a very long time, to Meyeril herself. Meyeril had found out 8 years ago. Not by being told, not exactly, but by finding a letter. A letter she was not supposed to find, left in a location where the only explanation for its presence was either accident or intention, and which contained enough to make clear that certain things about her entry into the royal family were not as purely coincidental as she had always believed. She had never spoken of it. She had held it in the private room of herself that she kept entirely separate from her role as queen consort, and she had thought about it, and she had chosen, consciously, deliberately, to let it remain where it was. She had made that choice for a reason, The reason was not deception, or not primarily deception. It was something closer to what a person feels when they discover that a kindness was extended to them in a form that was not quite transparent, not quite dishonest, but not fully honest either, and they understand, in the moment of discovering it, that the kindness was real and the impulse behind it was genuine, even if the method was complicated. She had understood why the late queen had done what she had done. She had, in truth, come to feel something like gratitude for it, however strange that gratitude felt. And she had chosen silence because the alternative, the conversation it would have required, the explanations and the examinations and the subsequent rearrangement of every relationship inside the palace, seemed to her at the time, and had continued to seem to her, more destructive than the silence itself. What she had not known was the account, the 347 million. She had not known about that. When Aldrich told her in the sitting room of their residential suite, her reaction had been genuinely, completely, unmistakably the reaction of someone hearing something for the first time. He had seen it on her face. He had known in that moment that whatever else was complicated about what his mother had done, this particular piece of it was news to Meyeril as much as to him. And that had changed something. It had not resolved anything. The complications were still there, dense and tangled, but it had changed the nature of what he thought he was dealing with. He was not dealing with a wife who had been complicit in a deception across an entire marriage. He was dealing with something more layered than that, a woman who had known part of a secret and kept it, not for gain, but because she had believed the knowledge belonged to a world that was past, a world that had resolved itself into the marriage and the life they had built, and did not need to be excavated. The account, though, the account was the part that could not be absorbed quietly. 347 million sterling, designated to Meyeril's pre-marriage name, set aside in a private banking institution in a city where royal assets went when the people who held them did not want those assets to be seen. This was the part that required an explanation that went beyond the personal, beyond the private, beyond the language of family complexity, and the interior architecture of difficult relationships. This was a fact about money, and facts about money had a way of demanding to be understood in legal and institutional terms, not just emotional ones. Adara Voss had begun that process of understanding. She had contacted Haller and Sohn through an intermediary and had requested the full documentation of the account, the original opening papers, the beneficiary designation in its complete form, and any additional instructions or letters of intent filed alongside it. The response from the banking house was prompt and professional. They would cooperate fully with the authorized representatives of the Eldenmore royal household. The documentation would take 7 to 10 working days to compile and transmit through the appropriate legal channels. In the meantime, the world outside Thornwall Palace had continued to build its own version of the story from the fragments available to it. The royal correspondents who had gathered outside the gates had now been joined by journalists from 3 other countries, drawn by the unusual combination of a queen consort's unexplained absence and the persistent, unverifiable rumor of Switzerland. The word had spread in the way that rumors spread in the age of private messages and international newsrooms, not published, not confirmed, but moving through the people who covered royal affairs with the unstoppable momentum of something that felt, to those carrying it, almost certainly true. A senior political commentator who had covered Eldenmore for 20 years published a column suggesting that the kingdom was in the early stages of a constitutional question that had not been publicly articulated. She was careful to publish no specific claims and to frame everything as hypothetical. But the column was read very widely, and the hypothetical it articulated, what happens when the financial legacy of a reigning monarch is found to have existed outside the visible boundaries of the royal estate, was a hypothetical that a significant number of constitutional lawyers, banking experts, and historians suddenly began to find interesting. In the hills, Queen Meyeril read the column. She had a subscription to the newspaper, and she read it every day, a habit she had maintained since long before the marriage. She read the column twice, with the same careful attention she brought to everything she read, and then she set the newspaper down on the kitchen table beside the glass of water that had been there since morning, and she looked out of the window at the hills for a long time. She was not by nature a person who dramatized her own situation. She had always been able to look at the facts of a thing, even an unwelcome thing, with a kind of clarity that she knew not everyone possessed and that she had never taken for granted. She looked at the facts now. A dead queen's hidden account, a sum of money no one had known about, her own name in a document she had never signed, a palace that had gone quiet. A husband who was trying, in his careful and decent way, to understand something that had no simple shape, and a world outside that was beginning to ask, in the language of hypotheticals and careful framings, whether the ground beneath the kingdom was as solid as it had always appeared. What she could not determine, looking at these facts in the gray afternoon light of a house in the hills, was what the late queen had intended. Not the practical intention, not what she had meant to do with the money or how she had imagined the discovery would unfold, but the deeper intention. The intention that had prompted a queen as careful and intelligent as Sarantha to set something like this in motion, to construct, across 38 years, a private arrangement whose meaning would only become fully legible after her death, and even then only to someone who already knew enough of the rest of the story to read it correctly. Was it protection? Was it apology? Was it something she could not give with words in life and had therefore given in the only form she knew would survive her? Myril had spent 8 years living alongside one piece of this story and had never been certain of the answer. She was still not certain. And the uncertainty had a particular quality to it, not the desperate uncertainty of someone who needs to know in order to go on, but the patient uncertainty of someone who has learned that certain things take the time they take to become clear, and that forcing them clear before they are ready only produces the illusion of understanding. She would wait, she was good at waiting. But she also knew that the waiting had a limit. There were things she would need to say, formally and on the record, and there were decisions she would need to make about what she wanted the shape of the rest of her life to look like. The house in the hills was quiet and private and exactly what she needed right now. But it was not a life. It was a pause, and the pause would have to end. Back at Thornwall Palace, on the evening of the 6th day, something happened that none of the people in Lord Carroll's small group of investigators had anticipated. A second letter arrived from Haller and Sohn. This one was shorter than the first and written in a slightly less formal register, as if the author of it had felt that the nature of its contents warranted a more direct mode of address. It explained that in the course of compiling the documentation requested by the legal counsel to the Crown, the banking house had identified an additional element of the account that had not been communicated in the initial notification. The additional element was a letter. A private letter, handwritten, sealed and filed with the bank under instructions that it was to be transmitted to the designated beneficiary, and to the designated beneficiary alone, upon the death of the account holder, or upon such time as the account's existence became known to the royal household, whichever came first. The conditions had now been met on both counts. The bank was therefore obligated to transmit the letter. They were transmitting it to Queen Myril directly as the designated beneficiary, through a secondary legal channel that bypassed the royal household entirely, as was their obligation under the terms of the original filing. It had, in other words, already been sent. It was already on its way to wherever Myril was. And the palace, with all of its lawyers and archivists and carefully assembled investigations, would not see its contents unless she chose to share them. Lord Carroll read this second letter and then looked out of the window at the stone courtyard for a long time. Then he said quietly to the empty room that the late queen had thought of everything. He was right, she had, and whatever was in that letter, it was going to be the thing that finally made the shape of this story legible. The question was what it would reveal, and the second question, which in some ways was the more important one, was what Queen Myril would choose to do with whatever she now knew. Copy full text. This is a work of fiction. All characters, kingdoms, institutions, and events are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental and unintended. Story: Queen Myril's dramatic exit follows the banker's bombshell about the late Queen's Swiss assets. Document 3 of 3. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. It came not in an envelope stamped with a bank's official crest, but in a plain outer casing, the kind that a firm of solicitors might use when transmitting a confidential document through a third party. The courier who delivered it to the house in the hills had no idea what he was carrying. He drove a small white van and had 4 other deliveries to make before noon. He noted only that the woman who answered the door seemed to have been expecting him, and that she took the envelope from him with a steadiness in her hands that he would later find difficult to describe accurately when asked about it, because it was not quite the steadiness of someone who felt calm, and it was not quite the steadiness of someone who felt afraid. It was something in between those two things, something he did not have a word for. Queen Myril closed the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment with the envelope in her hands. Her assistant was in the back of the house. The house was quiet. The hills were invisible this morning behind a low layer of gray cloud that had come in overnight and turned the world outside the windows into a single soft tone without depth or shadow. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She waited for it to boil because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who did not open envelopes that mattered in an attitude of impatience, but who gave themselves a moment and a reason to stand still before beginning the irreversible act of reading. She made the tea, she sat at the table, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single document from Haller and Sohn confirming the legal transmission of the enclosed personal correspondence, and behind that, folded once, a letter written by hand on cream paper in the distinctive, slightly angular handwriting of Queen Sarantha of Eldenmore. 4 pages. The date at the top was 3 years before her death, 2 years into her illness, during a period when the late Queen had been quietly reducing her public schedule and was known to have begun setting her affairs in order, though the extent to which she was doing so had never been publicly communicated. Myril read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you need to know first what it is before you can begin to understand it. Then she set it down and held her teacup in both hands and looked at the garden for a while. Then she picked the letter up and read it again, this time slowly, the way you read something that you are going to need to carry with you for a long time. The letter began without formality. It did not begin with Dear Myril or any other salutation. It began simply with the word you. As in, you are reading this, which means I am gone, and I am glad that I put this where it would reach you when it needed to. Because what I want to say to you, I was never able to say properly while I was alive. And the reasons for that are part of what I am going to try to explain, though I suspect you have already understood most of it, because you have always understood more than you have ever said, which is something I recognized in you from the very beginning and which was the first reason I trusted you. It went on from there. Queen Sarantha had spent 38 years building Eldenmore into the kingdom it had become. She had done this, she wrote, through a combination of public effort and private arrangement, and the private arrangements had often been more important than the public effort, though they were, by their nature, invisible. She had not been a sentimental woman, she said, and she hoped Myril would not interpret what followed as sentimentality, because it was not that. It was simply an account of facts, written in the only form she had available to her now, for a person she trusted to receive them honestly. She had seen early in her son's life that Aldrich had a particular quality, a quality of genuine goodness, which was not the same as weakness, though it was sometimes mistaken for it. He was not weak. He was deeply, authentically good in a way that the world did not always accommodate, and the world of royal governance accommodated it least of all. She had known, with the particular sadness of a parent who loves a child too well to deceive herself, that he would need someone beside him who had the capacity to hold that goodness steady, not to correct it or temper it or harden it into something more practically useful, but to surround it with enough strength and clarity that it could continue to be what it was without being destroyed by the pressures that surrounded it. She had looked quietly for a long time. She had looked the way she did everything, patiently, observantly, and without announcing what she was doing, and she had found Myril. Not easily and not immediately, but genuinely, through the ordinary channels of a life that moved through certain kinds of rooms and certain kinds of conversations. She had met her at a dinner, she wrote, and had known within an hour that she was looking at something uncommon. Not perfect, she had never been interested in perfection, which was an abstraction, but real and honest and strong in the ways that mattered. She had arranged for them to meet again. She had made certain that the path between Myril's world and Aldrich's world was a little shorter than it would otherwise have been. She had not manufactured the feeling between them. That had been entirely their own. This was the part, she wrote, that she hoped Myril could forgive, if forgiveness was the right word for it. She had interfered quietly in the life of another person, even if she had interfered with the best of intentions. She had decided, on behalf of her son and on behalf of Eldenmore, that a certain thing should happen, and she had used the means available to her to make it more likely that it would. She had done this without asking either Aldrich or Myril whether they wanted such interference. She had simply proceeded, as queens do, from an assessment of what was needed. She had also, she wrote, watched very carefully in the years that followed. She had watched the marriage form and establish itself. She had watched Myril grow into her role with exactly the kind of self-possession she had expected. And she had watched with a particular attention that she hoped had not been intrusive, though she suspected it sometimes was, for any sign that the interference she had committed had caused harm. She had not found such a sign. The marriage had been genuine. The love had been real. The life they had been built on true ground, not on the maneuvering of an old woman with a plan. For that, she was grateful in a way she had never found a way to express directly, because expressing it directly would have required admitting what she had done, and she had not been ready to do that while she was alive. That was the first failing she wanted to acknowledge, the inability to say a true thing out loud when saying it would have cost her something she was not ready to give. The second failing, she wrote, was the money.